Greetings, Pilgrims. Welcome to another episode of the Polygon Pilgrimage, and today we're going to be tackling one of my most requested things recently is an update on the minimap. So as you can see here, I have a completely blank scene except for our terrain that we downloaded from the first episode, and all I've got is a first-person character, the default light, and the terrain, and that's it. And we're going to build everything together. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with that, okay? So in the download package, you will find a couple of textures and things. So let me bring those over. Bring all those over here. So drag and drop, and they'll come in just like this, okay? So you just open up your download package, drag all these in, and it's 4 textures and the script file. So for our textures, let's select each of them. You can hold Shift and click once at the beginning, once at the end of the list here. And we're going to do the same thing to all 4. In the texture type, I'm going to choose that drop down. I'm going to say these are going to be sprites, so 2D and UI usage. And then down in the section called default, which is kind of a bad title, under the compression, I'm going to say none. No compression. I want them to look exactly as I intended. Click apply, and there we go. And you'll know that you've done it because this will change. You'll see that there's no longer that weird coloring, and this no longer looks stretched. So these are the 4 different things that we're going to do for our textures, okay? So we have our little scene here, we have our world here, and what we're going to be doing essentially is creating a secondary camera that's going to look down on our player like this, and it's going to output some stuff to the screen. So we're going to generate a canvas, we're going to put some UI elements together, and you're going to be a real wizard with this when we're all done. Okay, so first up, let's select our player, and we're going to use him as a vehicle to create our layers, but we need to actually tell the game that this is our player, because right now, it is a first-person controller, but it's not necessarily the player. So I'm going to choose this tag, and one of the default tags is player. If you don't have player, just like this, capital P, in your list, you can click Add Tag, click the plus, type player, capital P, and hit Save. And then to get back to it, you can just go click over here again, and now you can say player. There we go. So now we have told Unity that this is indeed going to be the player. Cool. Okay, now we're going to use them as a vehicle to create a layer for ourselves, because you can see these are the default layers: default, transparency, ignore raycast, water, and UI. Well, we need to add one, because we're going to add one that says anything on this layer, anything dealing with this layer we're going to generate is going to be related to the minimap. So I'm going to click Add to Layer, and just down here, the next available spot is number 8, and I'm going to type minimap, just like that, capital M, capital M. There you go, done. I'll click over here, and as an example, if I click this, you'll see it's now available. I don't want to put the first-person player on the minimap layer, but we just want to make sure that it is there for us. Okay, cool. So now, let's start generating stuff for the UI, all right? So we're going to create a canvas system. So if I right-click over here, let me actually delete this because I don't know what this is. Yeah, we'll just leave it there. Okay, let's do UI. So right-click, UI, and we're going to say canvas. There we go. Now the canvas is the system to how we put things on the screen. Think of it like a canvas, like when you paint, right? This is the stuff that you're going to see on the screen. So imagine if you just take that painting and made it like transparent and you put it in front of the player's face. This is what you're going to see. So for the canvas, this is all fine. I do want to check pixel perfect. And then under the canvas scaler, I'm going to change this to say scale with screen size. And I'm going to make my reference resolution 1920 by 1080. We want full 1080p. I'm going to tell it to match more on the width than on the height. And then for my reference pixels, I cannot find a good example for this. See, the description says 1 pixel of sprite will cover 1 unit in UI. So just in case, I put this at 1920. I don't know if that's a huge number. I don't know if that's bad. That's just what I do, and it seems to work. So there we go. Okay, so we have our canvas, but if we look at our game view so far, there's nothing on the canvas. It's totally blank. So we're going to add some stuff. So I'm going to right-click on the canvas, and I'm just going to create an empty object. So just create an empty object, and I'm going to call this my minimap underscore UI. So this is just a container for all the minimap stuff that we're going to create. So I'm going to click this, so I can say, where do I want the anchor to be? So you want our minimap is going to be in the bottom right-hand corner. So I'm going to hold Alt, and you can see that the icons kind of change here, and I'm going to click the bottom right-hand corner. And you can see that automatically changes some numbers here, but we're going to set some custom values anyway. So for the position X, I'm going to do -155. For the position Y, I'm going to say 250. For the height and width both, I'm going to set this to 256, okay? Because that's how big our texture is going to be. Cool, so that's all set. Now, I'm going to right-click on the minimap UI, and I'm going to say create a UI, and I want a raw image, okay? And this image we're going to call mask. Now, center is fine because he is centered to this object that we already created, which has a position. So you'll see that in a moment. So don't worry that this is centered and this has a position because it's supposed to be. This is a child of this. So for the mask, we don't need to change any of that, but we do need to change the size, 256 by 256. Now you'll see this is the total size and position that our minimap will be in. It's just, we can see it now. Okay, so now we need to add a component to this. I'm going to click Add Component, and this will be like this when you come up. So type in mask, M-A-S-K. And the first one, we're going to select that, and then I'm going to say, don't show the mask graphic. So it is working, but right now it's invisible, okay? Now, let's collapse this, and I'm going to right-click on Canvas again. Let's see, no, right-click on the Minimap UI, sorry. Now we're going to create another UI raw image. Now I want this to be at the same level as this, not underneath of this. So I'm going to click and drag up to Canvas. So there you go. So now if I open up Minimap UI, you see that we have that, and we have mask, but I don't want this to be a child of mask. So, oh no, I'm sorry, it was correct the first one. So your image, let's name it real fast. So this is going to be our Minimap frame, okay? So this Minimap frame, you just want to drag and drop it here on Minimap UI. So now he needs to be underneath as far as vertically on the screen here, the mask, but we don't want it to be a child of the mask per se, okay? So this Minimap frame, he's just going to be a texture. So let's set him to 256, 256. His position should be 000. There we go. So he looks like this right now. We're going to take this one that says BRS_MM_outer. So that's our outer frame texture. So we're going to click and drag him right on there. And now you can see what we got going on. This is the frame around the very edges of our minimap. Pretty cool, right? Okay, now let's go back to our mask, and we're going to right click, and we're going to say UI raw image. Now this will create a child of the mask. And you can tell it's a child because if I collapse this, it goes away. That means it's underneath the mask. But these two things are at the same level, if that makes sense. So underneath the mask, what is this thing going to be? Well, this is going to be our Minimap texture. So that's what he is. And I'm actually going to add an underscore in between this just because we're actually going to call the texture Minimap texture as well. I just don't want any confusion. There we go. And again, 256 by 256. And right now he's solid white because there's nothing to display yet, okay? So let's fix that. So what we're actually going to display here is a texture that's going to get updated every single frame. So here in our folder, I'm going to right click and I'm going to say create. And what we want to create is something called a render texture. So I'm going to click on that. And let's call it Minimap texture, just like that. And the size is fine, 256 by 256. Everything else is fine here. You don't have to do anything with that. So back over here, let's click on our Minimap texture again. And I'm going to click and drag this guy into the texture slot. And you'll notice that there's nothing here yet, because technically right now there's no camera that is filling this texture. So what our Minimap camera is going to do is every frame is going to gather what it sees, and it's going to fill this texture in and kind of overwrite that. Imagine opening up a file in Photoshop, and you paint something and hit save, and you paint something again, hit save. So it keeps changing. So this is going to keep changing, and then this texture that is right here, that is invisible right now, is going to say, I'm going to display whatever this is. That's why we clicked and dragged it right there. So it's going to display that changing or updating texture. Very cool. Okay, so all of this is good here. We're done here, so we can collapse the canvas for right now. So our canvas works, and if I hit play, you'll see that we won't see anything yet, but there we go. So there he is, and we can see the Minimap where it's going to be on the screen. Cool. So we've done a lot of setup. I know it doesn't feel like it yet. One more thing, if you want, under the canvas, I'm going to right click and say UI, another raw image, and let's just call this cursor. If you'd like to see where we're pointing, this is how we can do that. So for the cursor, I'm going to click and drag the texture that is provided, the BRS cursor, and I'm going to change this down to 64 by 64. And there you go. That's just to have a little something to look at so that when we run around and you're looking at the world, you can actually tell where you're pointing. Okay? So just for referencing. Cool. So that's all done. So again, let's collapse our canvas. Now, we need to figure out how to display our player on the minimap, and we'll do the minimap and the thing at the end, but we need to figure out how to display our player. So what we're going to do is underneath the FPS controller, I'm going to right click and say create an empty. And this empty, I'm going to call this player icon. And while we're here, let's put the player icon on the minimap layer because we want this to show up on the minimap. We're going to put its position 0 on the X, but 6 up on the Y and 0 for the Z. Then I'm going to right click on player icon and say create a 3D object. I want you to create a plane. And now this is where it gets a little crazy looking, but trust me, follow me. Here's our plane, okay? So let's call this icon. So this is the actual icon that we're going to display, which is going to be this guy here, okay? Now our plane needs a couple of things. I think for my notes here, let me take a look. Yes, 0, 0. So on the Y, we need to rotate him -90. It's just to get it to face the correct direction for the texture. You'll see in a second. Now the scale here, this will determine how big it appears on the minimap. And I'll show you that in a little bit, but I'm going to set mine to 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. It's going to look huge right here, but when you're way up in the sky looking at the overall area, you need it to be kind of large so you can see it. One thing we need to do though is under your mesh renderer, open up your lighting. We're going to turn off cast shadows. We're going to turn off receive shadows because we don't want it to shadow the world. And the reason we put it 6 units above the player is if this is as tall as your player is, even if they look straight up, you'll never see it because it's transparent from the underneath. But it's on the minimap layer, so the minimap looking down will see it. Pretty clever, huh? Okay, so with that in place, we need to create a material. And one cheap and easy way we can do this is if I just click and drag our texture and drop it over here for the icon, it will create a material called BRS icon. Now we need to make some changes because obviously this looks like garbage, right? So let's change our rendering mode from opaque, change that to cutout. And now it's starting to look a lot better. Now our alpha cutoff needs to be a lot smaller, so let's do 0.05. And let's change our smoothness all the way to 0. So now this will be our icon, and it looks terrible right here, but when you're all the way up here and you got all the other textures around it, it looks pretty good. And this is kind of based upon the one you see in PUBG, so this is kind of based on that. So there you go. Okay, so that guy should be all set. Since our icon is on minimap layer, this guy is on minimap layer because he's a child of that, so we should be all set there as well. There we go. Okay, so we're moving right along. We've created our render texture, we've got our FPS controller, we've got the frame, we've got everything all set up. So now all we really need is the actual minimap camera and the script to make it follow us around. Okay, so let's create the minimap camera. I'm going to right click and say camera. Boom. Let's call it minimap camera. Cool. It does not need to be on the minimap layer because it won't ever see itself, but it just makes me feel better to have it on there. Now, we need to make sure that this is following the player, so it needs to start where the player is. So what I'm going to do is click and drag it underneath the FPS controller, and then I will zero out its positioning and all this information. So this should all be 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. Right? So this is exactly where the player is right now. So now what I'm going to do is click and drag it all the way to the bottom to make it independent. So make it all by itself. And you'll notice that now it fills in some data here because this is that same position but in world space now. Okay? So that's cool. So we're all set there. And I'm going to change its Y positioning to something like 1100. So make it really, really high up in the sky. So let's come way out and take a look. He's way up here. He's way up here. See, there he is. But he's also not the correct type of camera, so we need to change some settings here. First of all, let's get rid of the flare layer. We don't need that. Remove component. Right-click on the gear for this guy as well. The audio listener, we only need one per scene for our camera, which is the camera on the player, so we don't need this one. Remove component. Skybox, I'm going to change this to say solid color. The background color I'm going to set as black. Culling mask, I'm going to say nothing, and then I'm going to choose minimap. So this will only view and capture things on the minimap layer. And remember, we did that earlier on purpose. Our projection, we're going to change this to orthographic, which means it's like it's a straight up and down camera or left and right camera. It's not taking in perspective information. So here's what that looks like right now. We need to change the rotation on the X to say 90, so it's going to look straight down. And you'll notice now that it's looking straight down, look what it's seeing. It's seeing our player icon that we set to the proper minimap layer. Cool. Let's change our size to 50. The near doesn't really matter. The far, I'm going to set to 5,000 just so we can see everything. And the depth, I'm going to set to 10. Now, one last thing. You can see that it's not seeing the ground yet, and we can look at that. And we need to set up what this camera is actually going to do as far as the target texture. So every frame that this camera captures something, it will fill in anything you put in here. So what are we going to put? We're going to put our minimap texture in there. So now every frame that this camera captures information, it's going to update this texture, which, if you remember, we happen to be displaying right here. Funny how that works, right? So our minimap camera is almost all set. Everything here is good. Everything looks good. So let's give it a whirl. Let's hit play and see what happens. So we can see, and if I rotate, because the player icon is attached to me, it rotates and it shows my orientation in the world. But you'll notice that we don't see the ground at all, and that's because the terrain does not yet have the proper layer tag. Right now the terrain is set to the default layer. So if I change that to minimap, all of a sudden you see it shows up here. So now if I hit play, the minimap won't follow us, but if I start to move, you can see that it's displaying downward properly, and it's displaying me when I'm underneath of it. Now, it's not following us because we haven't told it to. It's just sitting there in space. So let's give it some code to make that work. So here's the script, and it's not very complex. I'll go over it with you if you want. So minimap camera, I'm going to select that, and I'm going to click and drag and drop and add that code. Now if I hit play, it had a problem. Let's take a look at what the problem is. I put the script on there. Minimap, let's take that off. Okay, the script is on there. Everything should be up. Minimap height. I forgot to set it up. So the minimap height, it will automatically set the minimap to this height, and I set it to 0, which means it went all the way underground. We don't really want that at all. Okay, now it should be following us properly. Yep, there we go. So now this is a proper minimap. This is the kind of minimap that I like, where the minimap just kind of pans with me, and it shows me the environment as I'm coming up on it, but my rotation in it is based upon my rotation in the world. So I can be kind of moving backwards and still exploring in the minimap. I can't quite point to it, but exploring in the minimap this area that I'm coming into, but by walking backwards I can still look in this direction. So I find that very handy. But if you happen to be the kind of person that likes the minimap to rotate with you, all you have to do is check this box and then hit play. And now when I rotate, it rotates the entire minimap in accordance with my character. So as I move around and I'm looking around at the world, as I rotate, it is correctly displaying exactly what's in front of me, and I can just look at the world and say, okay, well, over there is this. And this might be a better style for you if you're looking for things like icons in the minimap that are based upon their position in the world. Well, then this is a great solution for that. Okay, so there you go. It's all working. It's all set up. It's not too complex. One easy script. So let's take a look at the script together, and I'll just kind of go over it a little bit, but it will be part of the free download, and you saw how to set it up there. You just drag and drop it, and that's all there is to it. Okay, so at the top in our variables here, we need a variable where we get a handle to the player, so game object player. A boolean, that's the checkbox if you want to rotate with the player or not. The float value is the minimap height, how high up in the sky you want your minimap to be. We need a transform for our original parent, and then transform for the player parent. So in start, we're going to find the game object in the world that has the tag of player and say that's going to be our player. Sounds good. Our transform.position is going to be equal to the player's position, X and Z, but the Y value is going to be filled by that minimap height. So I set the 1100, so that's what it gets set to. And we're going to store our original parent as our current parent, which at the beginning of the game, the parent is none. It's just kind of in the hierarchy by itself. And the player parent is going to be the player transform. So on late update, because we want to make sure that everything else has happened, and then the minimap updates to make sure we see it. And this happens literally, hundredths of a second after update, so you won't tell the difference. If we're rotating with the player, well then set our parent to the player's parent that we stored, and set our position equal to X, Z, and the height. Okay? Pretty simple. Otherwise, if we're not rotating with the player, we still have to follow the player. So set our our parent equal to our original parent, pardon me, and then we're just going to set our position to follow the player. So the player transform.x and the player transform.z and our normalized height. The only difference with this one is if we are rotating with the player, then we're already a child of the player, so we don't have to set it to player x, because that's just transform.x. Okay? And that's it. I mean, it's less than 37 lines of code. Whole thing is done, the whole thing works. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to go back and show you really fast the the player icon here, the icon itself. This size determines the size you see here. So if I were to set this to something like 3, and then we hit play, you'll see that the icon gets really big on the minimap. But this is a property of two different things. You'll notice that the rocks around me in the minimap actually, they display, or they represent rather, about 2 or 3 or 500 feet worth of stuff. So right now my icon is huge. So really, if I were to come down here and say, put this at 0.75, 0.75, 0.75, 0.75, this is probably more accurate based upon the size of the terrain around me. Okay, so this feels a bit better as far as where my player actually is. So this is going to be a balance. And there's a balance between the size you have here. I think 1.5 works out pretty well for me. I think that it's fair. Balance between the scale here and in your minimap camera, your size here. So see if I make this really, really big, it like zooms the minimap way out. And if I make this really, really small, it gets really close to me. So you're going to have to balance those two things. But for me, I put it at 50 for the size. And then, pardon me, for the icon here, I put the scale at 1.5. And that seems to work pretty nicely for me. I like that. If I'm running around and I'm doing stuff and I'm picking up items and shooting people and doing whatever, I look over the minimap, I might be a little oversized technically, but graphically, visually, it looks good and it feels good. So salt to taste there, do as you like, but that's what you'll get. So after all said and done, we've created our canvas, we've created our minimap UI with our texture. We have a live camera in the world. Let's take a look at that. Way up here, this camera, which is feeding information to our UI in real time. We're displaying it, and then we're using a mask to kind of mask out any excess. We have a nice little frame that goes on top of that. And then we have our script on our minimap camera with an option to rotate with the player or not. I tend to like not. I think that it looks cooler if I can have, like I said, that tactical advantage of moving this direction but still looking this direction. But you can choose what you like. The only caveat to that is you have to make sure you check it or uncheck it before you hit play mode. If you check it or uncheck it and like you're paused, your results may vary, and I'm not responsible for that. It might kind of get wonky on you there. So make sure that you are in this kind of state and then you make that decision and then hit play. But that's it, guys. I hope that you've enjoyed very much. If you guys have comments, questions, if you have trouble with this, let me know. I am going to provide, for the first time ever, I'm going to try this out. If you guys are on the same version of Unity as me, then I will provide the actual scene for the beginning and ending states, and I'll provide all the textures and the script and everything. So with all of that, you should be able to piece together the beginning, the start phase when we started the video, and the end phase to how it exists now. And hopefully that will help you kind of get all that figured out if you do have any qualms or problems. But make sure you follow all the steps exactly, and make sure you go through the whole video and take a look at it, take your time with it. And if you have any questions still, don't forget, link in the description for the Discord. Ask a question there and we'll get back to you. And yeah, I hope very much you guys have enjoyed. And until next time, guys, keep practicing, get better, and I'll see you next time as the pilgrimage continues.